Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for Grantmakers in the Arts webinar, Demographic Data Collection, Understanding Who Benefits from Our Funding Support. I'm Sujin Chan, GIA's Program Manager. Today's webinar topic comes directly from last year's GIA webinar series on racial equity in arts grant making. Last year we spent 4 sessions discussing how funders could review and revise their grant making policies and practices to achieve greater racial equity in their grant-making outcomes. During those sessions, you asked the critical question, well, how do we know that our dollars are going to organizations that are led, programmed, and serving African, Latinx, Asian, Arab, and Native American leaders, artists, staff, and audiences? You asked about how you might be able to collect that information. Demographic data collection is not a new topic, but it's one that continues to puzzle the field on questions of validity, rigor, sensitivity, and capacity. The D5 Coalition and DataArts, formerly known as Cultural Data Project, began focusing its efforts on this issue a few years ago. And today we'll hear from Beth, Tuttle, President and CEO from DataArts, on these efforts, current and developing methodologies, and how developments can help the field of arts philanthropy. We'll also hear from Bronwyn Mauldin, Director of Research and Evaluation with the Los Angeles County Arts Commission, which is a public funder, on their pilot project collecting demographic information on organizational workforces. And we'll also be hearing from Elizabeth Love, Senior Program Officer with the Houston Endowment, on their pilot project on collecting demographic information on audiences. We're really excited that they're joining us and look forward to hearing about their work. So before we start, a little housekeeping note. Throughout the presentation, you can type questions into the rectangular text box at the bottom of your screen. We will answer these questions during a Q&A session at the conclusion of the presentation. So first, I'm going to hand this off to Beth. Welcome, Beth.
Hi, apologies, I was still muted despite all of that. Thanks so much, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here today, and it's wonderful to have this opportunity to talk about this important topic. Since DataArts' launch in 2004, we have been at the forefront of collecting in-depth standardized information on the finances and activities of cultural nonprofits across all disciplines. And our goal has been to bring the language and leverage of data to the business of arts and culture and philanthropy. Today, more than about 16,000 cultural nonprofits in all 50 states have contributed annual data profiles. We began this work on demographics, though, back in about 2010, with a pilot in which we learned that fewer than 25% of responding cultural nonprofits were actively collecting information about the identities of their workforce or audiences. We also learned, because we asked them a number of questions about their practices, we learned that their primary reasons for not doing this were that they felt they had lack of expertise and they didn't have access to appropriate tools for doing this. They also had some fear about legal implications and discomfort around issues of privacy. So all of those things told us that given the increasing urgency of questions about how to address issues of equity and diversity and inclusion in both the arts and cultural and the philanthropic sectors, that there was really considerable work to be done. So as Sujin mentioned, in 2014 we began to work with a national task force that included grant makers, the Foundation Center, GuideStar, the D5 Coalition, dozens of nonprofit stakeholders, and we were working on developing a demographic survey with a goal of coming up with something that would allow individuals to self-identify. The survey that we developed looks at 6 different aspects of identity, which includes race and heritage, gender, age, LGBTQ, and disability status. We've now conducted a number of studies, about 5 or 6 since 2015, with partners ranging from Jerome and McKnight and the Surdna Foundations to Dance New York City, and just recently completed with Los Angeles County Arts Council and the Houston Endowment and Houston Arts Alliance. I want to start by briefly explaining the individual demographic survey methodology that we use to learn about workforce characteristics, which is what we have been implementing for both LA County Arts Council and what we will soon be implementing for the Houston Endowment. So I'm just going to walk you through for a moment how the system works. So we collect the data directly from staff, board, volunteers, and contracted personnel, which includes artistic staff typically, through an anonymous web link to the survey. The data goes directly to DataArts for analysis rather than having it collected or aggregated by an individual within the organization itself. We do this as a way to begin to address the concerns about the privacy of the data. Too often you have an individual, and one of the complaints we heard during that first pilot was that someone inside their organization either had to ask for this information or make guesses about people's identity, and people really felt that was not an appropriate way to go about this. So once we receive the data, we aggregate the responses from individuals into organization level and community level data sets. So a community is defined as the universe of participating organizations. And that depends. Sometimes that's a group of applicants to a particular funder or a collection of organizations in a specific geographic area, or it might be grouped by specific discipline, as the Dance New York City example was. Later this year, for example, we are going to be, or we hope to be administering a study to a group of funders that focus on a specific type of funding. DataArts then produces reports always at the community level, and when we can, we will produce individual organization reports. So in order to produce organization level reports or individual organizational reports, they have to have a minimum of 7 respondents and a statistically significant number of respondents as a percentage of their total workforce. And the reason for these requirements is that with less than that kind of response, we can't maintain the privacy of those individuals. So what I'm showing you here is the beginning opening. I'm going to show you 2 slides from the survey itself. Now, the survey is administered online. You can take it from your phone. You can take it from your computer, or you can take it from any kind of mobile device. They are, we provide them with a survey link, and they just log in. So participants come in here, and they're asked to affiliate with an organization, typically that is selected from a preloaded list of those that are being invited to participate. If a person is affiliated with more than one organization, which sometimes happens because someone may be a staff member at one organization and a board member at another, they have an opportunity to select up to 3 and to identify their role with each of those organizations. And although it's not visible on this particular slide, participants are also asked if they identify themselves as an artist. And if they do identify as an artist, we also ask them whether they're paid for their work as an artist. And this was added specifically in response to our partners in the arts field who really wanted to be able to understand what's happening with those who are artists in the field, and recognizing that so many artists are working in the field but not particularly as not being compensated as artists. As I mentioned, the survey is anonymous, but respondents are prevented from taking it more than once. So the next slide you'll see, which is looking at heritage and categories of heritage, you'll see that we use a more nuanced set of heritage categories than does the U.S. Census. Many individuals, as you may know, have objected to the limited census definitions. And we really wanted to make sure that participants could effectively see themselves more accurately defined. If, in fact, you were to take the survey today and you selected Asian descent or European descent, you would be offered a series of choices to define which part of those areas of the world you came from, which really was important to the stakeholder groups that helped us structure this survey instrument. In the reporting phase, we employ a logic that lets our research team map the responses back to census for purposes of comparison, which is something that we certainly did for LA County's study. And then at the bottom, you'll see this open-ended question that says, my ethnic identity is. We included this because we wanted to invite respondents to be able to describe their ethnicity in their own words. And that has proven to be a really interesting part of what comes back in the study. So I'm showing you here some samples of the survey reports that we produce. And you'll see these word clouds here in both of these examples. And the word clouds are generated by the free text entries that respondents choose to write about themselves. And I think that at some point there's going to be some very interesting work that can be done using text analysis of this sort of free choice language that people are using to describe something that is very personal to them. I'm now going to talk for just a minute about audience demographics methodology. We all know that audience segmentation studies are in very high demand, but they're often really costly and they require more expertise than many organizations have resident in their own staff. So we're currently in the midst of a 3-year pilot with the Houston Endowment and the Houston Arts Alliance to test several audience demographic methodologies that could result in our being able to offer these services effectively, affordably, and equitably to groups of organization in any region of the country. So I'm going to walk you through now the process for how we are conducting this pilot with Houston, and then Elizabeth is going to talk a little bit more about the pilot and what we've been learning. So in this methodology, nonprofits provide their patron lists to DataArts. The lists are kept secure and we don't use them for any purpose other than this particular research. DataArts then cleans and duplicates the list through the National Change of Address Service, and one of the benefits to those organizations is that they get their lists back all clean and tidy with no duplicates in them. We also are able to work with either a full mailing address or we have been able to work with email addresses only. And I'm sure many of you do work with applicant organizations that are small, that may not, that may only be collecting email addresses. And in the past, it's been very, very challenging for organizations to learn much about who those people are that are associated with those email addresses. So this process that we're using allows us to then begin to associate demographic data back even if we do not have a full household address. So we're working with 3 different methodologies for the Houston pilot. In the first methodology, we take that batch of patron addresses. We then use the U.S. Census data, which is a publicly available information, and we geocode each of those addresses. And we aggregate the demographic data to provide both the Houston Endowment and the organizations participating in the pilot with a general snapshot of the average community characteristics where their audience members reside. Now, this is not an uncommon methodology. People do use it if they have access to geocoding, but we know that there's some limitations to that because just because you're doing a particular performance in a particular location does not necessarily mean that they match the population of that particular zip code. So the second method, which is designed to get a little bit deeper than that, we work with a third party, Arts and Analytics, to append individual demographic data, individual household level demographic data that is gathered by Axiom or TargetSmart or one of the other commercial consumer data sources. And we append that very specific demographic data to the records that we've been provided. Now what this does is it offers a significantly higher degree of accuracy than a simple census overlay would. The way we do this is because we are contracting for this service with a very high volume of individual records. So I think in Houston there were over 1 million patrons that were combined from about 75 organizations. We're able to secure really favorable pricing for a service that is typically out of reach for most organizations. So if an individual organization with a couple of, with maybe 10,000 records went to try to purchase this service, it would cost a couple of dollars per household record. When we do it in this way, it brings that cost down to a couple of cents per household record. The third method that we're working and is currently being tested involves administering individual surveys, basically the same survey that I just showed you for the workforce, to patrons, either on-site or via email. And there are a lot of implications and issues involved with that, specifically related to providing and finding the right motivation for those patrons to provide that information, and understanding how best to engage them in that. So these are just a couple of reports I'm going to put up here to just show you what comes out, and then Elizabeth will and Bronwyn will talk a little bit more about this. But our goal in doing this multimodal approach is that we're trying to validate each of these methodologies against one another. And we're doing that so that we can start to figure out what's the sweet spot for accuracy, ease of administration, participation rates, and affordability. Because if we find that doing the individual patron surveys is really costly and isn't providing us with information that is particularly different, for example, from the information we're able to garner from the patron, the commercial consumer data append methodology, one or the other of those may win out, if you will, as the kind of approach that could be scalable. And I speak to that because here at DataArts, we're not in the business of we're not a commercial consultant to arts and culture organizations, so we are not typically looking to do an individual arts aid organization engagement to help them do patron analytics or to help them do pricing studies. We are trying to come up with solutions that can be applied very broadly to the field and applied in a way that is equitable and affordable for the field. So I think I'm going to stop there and just hand off now to Bronwyn to talk a little bit more about the work we did in Los Angeles County, and then on to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Beth. So here in Los Angeles County, just a few background notes about who we are at the Arts Commission. We provide services in a region that encompasses 88 municipalities and 137 unincorporated areas. We make $4.5 million in grants each year to more than 380 arts nonprofits. We partner with nearly 70 local school districts to support arts education. And we manage the county's Percent for Art program, as well as managing the county's art collection. Collecting demographic data about our local arts workforce was part of a much larger initiative here in LA County that was launched by our County Board of Supervisors. They tasked us with going through a very public process, developing actionable recommendations that would improve cultural equity and inclusion in the arts across the county. So the timing for this was really quite perfect. So we hired DataArts to conduct their survey here in LA County. I believe we're the largest geographic area they've done, and if we couldn't break it, no one can. So the good news is that the county committed funds for us to conduct the survey annually for up to 5 years. This means that we're going to have the time to both improve data collection and to measure change over time. So we're really interested in seeing, now that we've done year 1, how are things going to look in years 2, 3, 4, and onward. So I'm going to share a little bit of findings with you. We're just going to just touch just skim the surface a little bit. I'm going to show you 3 charts. There's much more in the report, and we'll make sure you have access to the report. It's posted online. But let me tell you, at the broadest, at the highest level, there were no surprises. Our arts workforce here in LA County is dominated by straight white women. That may sound familiar to you. But it's when we get into the details that the DataArts survey allowed us to do where we start to see really interesting things. For example, we can break out some of these major categories by budget size. and start to see some interesting nuances. And if you take a look at, we've got race and ethnicity by budget size for our arts workforce here in LA County, you can see that that group of arts organizations with annual budgets between $500,000 and $10 million look a bit different from organizations that are both larger and smaller. So that's one interesting example. Another one, we're able to break out the groups by type of organization. And again, you can see some really interesting nuances here. I mean, take a look at this collecting, curating, and exhibiting workforce by age compared to all of the other types of organizations we have here in LA County. And then, a third example, we can break things out by role. And right here, what you're going to see is something that will probably look very familiar to you if you've looked at a lot of other studies about the arts workforce that have been done. A lot of women in our local workforce, but as you go up the ranks to higher levels, the number of women in the workforce decreases. So there's just a ton more information. We'll send out the link later, but lots more charts that break everything out, slice and dice things in a lot of different ways. A couple of thoughts after our experience of doing it in year one. And the first thing is that this work doesn't come easy and it doesn't come cheap. DataArts did the heavy lifting on designing the survey. It was great to be able to use an existing instrument that they'd done a ton of work and done all their due diligence on developing. They did the collection, they did the analyzing of the data, and that was a huge amount of work. On our end, as the Arts Commission, our job was publicizing and distributing the survey to all the arts nonprofits around the county, so that we could get a statistically significant sample, which we did achieve. It was a ton of work. It was a lot of emails, a lot of phone calls, there were face-to-face meetings, making sure that we could get the response rate that we needed. And then writing the final report it really was a true partnership between us and DataArts, because we were doing this in the midst of a larger initiative, and the final report needed to speak to very local concerns and local issues. So whereas the data itself we can use, national models and other things, in our final report has to be relevant locally. And I think that's something, an interesting piece of the puzzle that anyone who's going to be doing this would need to pay attention to. Now, I'm going to very briefly talk about looking at who our grantees are serving and the communities they serve, because we've taken a very different approach to this. We've been focusing on how to get our grantee reports to deliver better data to us. This is more efficient. Grantees are already reporting, so how can we make our reports better rather than doing additional or separate surveys? But that said, we are paying very close attention to what's going on in Houston. We are really interested to see what they learn from that and see what we can use here. But as a thought for if you can't do that yet, what can you do in the meantime? We've made questions to our grantee reporting. So we have added project-specific questions to help us understand who's being served. We have a typology. So we're asking, are you serving homeless individuals, foster youth, veterans? We've got age groups, gender, race, and ethnic groups. And some of this information appears in the cultural data profile, but we're actually asking the question about the project rather than the organization. So it goes into a little more detail. We're also asking for more specific detail on geography, because knowing the location of where the organization is headquartered, as we all know, is extremely limited. So we're trying to, we're asking questions both in text form and in zip codes. Obviously, zip code analysis has its limits, but it does give us some basic information that we can use. We're being really cognizant of whether we're adding new demands on our grantees. So as we have added questions, we've deleted questions that weren't delivering the data that was useful for us. And I should say we've cut back significantly on word count for some of our narrative questions in order to make sure that we're getting the data that we need to answer these very urgent questions about who are our grantees serving and how are we in terms of cultural equity and inclusion in the arts? I'll stop there. Obviously, we'll all be answering questions later in the Q&A.
Well, thanks, Bronwyn. Good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Love. I'm with Houston Endowment, which is a private place-based foundation focused on advancing equity of opportunity for the people of Greater Houston and enhancing the vibrancy of the city. So in keeping with our mission's focus on equity and vibrancy, one of the overarching goals that drives our arts grant making is to create opportunities for all Houstonians to engage in diverse and meaningful cultural experiences. However, our observation is that today, Houston's arts audiences may be older, wider, wealthier, and more educated than the general population. And we've speculated that a mix of barriers, geographic, socioeconomic, cultural, and structural, could be preventing folks from fully engaging in the arts. Thus, our grant making is focused in large part on removing these barriers and cultivating audiences that reflect the demographics of Greater Houston. To this end, we very much believe that the first step to cultivating tomorrow's audiences is knowing today's audiences. We think that knowing who is and who isn't engaging with the arts enables more informed and authentic conversations about why this might be, and helps clarify goals, helps set priorities, and helps to track progress over time. However, we found that most arts groups in Houston don't have the expertise or the capacity to learn much about their audiences. And among those who do, there's a wide range of methods used, from we've seen manually counting attendance and making visual guesses of certain demographic characteristics, to collecting zip codes and making assumptions about socioeconomic status based on geography. And in some rare cases, among a really small handful of very well-resourced groups, employing sophisticated market research strategies that one might see in the entertainment industry. So we wondered if it might be possible to develop a common tool for Houston's arts groups to learn about their audiences. This dream tool would be one that could also roll up to show an aggregated picture of arts engagement in Houston, with the ability to break it down by discipline or by size, and to look at factors beyond ethnicity, such as income, age, and education, which is really important to us here in Houston. We realized that capacity within our local arts groups is the major barrier, so we knew that in order for anyone to use it, this magical tool would need to be cheap and would need to place minimal burdens on staff or volunteer time. The cultural data profile seemed to us like a logical platform for something like this, so my colleague Long Chu and I reached out to the team at DataArts and challenged them to come up with a methodology to analyze audience data that even the smallest, most resource-challenged group might find feasible and useful, and that could ideally be incorporated as a permanent module in the CDP someday. You've heard Beth describe the methodology of the three-tiered system and the pilot effort thus far. So to invite participation in the pilot, we teamed up with the Houston Arts Alliance, which is our local arts agency, to invite our respective grantees. I'll note that there was a wide range of reactions to the invitation. On one end of the spectrum, some felt it was honestly yet another administrative burden being imposed on artists by funders. This would be a compliance tool or a tool to grade and penalize them. Yet, on the other end, there were a number who were genuinely enthusiastic at the opportunity to get to know their audiences a little better so they could better narrate their story and their impact. There were also a few folks who were initially interested but ultimately declined due to concerns about sharing their patron data. So just under 50 groups ended up participating in 2 phases of the pilot, which is about 40% of all of the groups that were participating in the CDP at the time that we were recruiting. We were really happy that there was a wide range of disciplines and sizes, ranging for example, the very small Brazilian Arts Foundation, which has assets of just $10,000, to the very large Houston Museum of Natural Science, which has a budget of $50 million and one of the largest museum audiences in town. So how do we plan to use the audience demographics data? First, we hope to partner with arts groups to apply their data to help them broaden their audiences. I'll note that through our conversations with pilot groups and through a focus group that DataArts conducted just last week, we know that there's a good amount of enthusiasm about the process as well as the findings and how they might be used. For example, one of the early participants in the pilot was Stages, a mid-sized theater that's at a critical point in its life. It's moving to a new location, it's rethinking its programming, and it's looking to substantially increase its overall audience. The findings from the pilot, which showed that Stage's audience was older, whiter, wealthier, and more educated than Houston's overall population, was one of several factors that pushed them to think about elevating equity and to consider that perhaps an intentional diversity and inclusion effort might help them connect with different people. So with Houston Endowment funding, Stages has engaged Art Equity to facilitate the development of an equity, diversity, and inclusion strategic plan. The first such plan among any performing arts group in Houston, and just the second in Texas that we know of. Practically, we also hope to work with organizations to help them use the data to address sustainability. As you all know, individual donors often provide a large share of revenue for arts organizations, and of course, today's audiences are tomorrow's donors. So we think the audience demographics data could be helpful in cultivating donors in two ways. First, learning more about current audiences could help an organization build more authentic and lasting relationships that could translate to dollars. And second, learning about who's not coming could help inform how to reach these potential audiences who, again, could become future donors. So in addition to working with individual organizations, we at the Endowment are hoping to use the aggregate findings to inform our grant-making strategy. The pilot, as Beth said, included just around 1 million deduplicated records, which we feel is sufficiently robust to be able to draw at least some preliminary and very general sector-wide conclusions that really affirmed our previous observations. For example, the pilot showed that 75% of the combined audiences from the pilot has a college degree or higher. Well, in Houston, just 28% of the population has a college degree, so there's a clear imbalance there. Similarly, while 51% of Houstonians has an annual income below $56,000, just 23% of the combined audiences from the pilot has an income below $56,000. And while just 31% of Houstonians are classified as white or Caucasian, 2/3 or 67% of the combined audiences from the pilot were white. These imbalances really underscored to us the urgency of removing those systemic barriers to engaging with the arts. We don't have answers yet, but we're discussing reorienting our capacity building initiatives to emphasize equity, diversity, and inclusion, addressing certain structural challenges facing a number of our culturally specific institutions, and figuring out how we might elevate the contributions of individual artists and communities. In addition to informing our grant-making strategy, we're hoping to integrate the aggregate data into our measurement and evaluation function, essentially using it as our baseline. And if the pilot transitioned to becoming a standard module within the CDP, a means to track sector-wide progress towards equitable arts engagement over time. Finally, we hope the aggregate data can be used in local policy conversations. For example, we're part of a local task force that's thinking about options for additional public funding for the arts beyond our local hotel occupancy tax, which, due to its focus on tourism, isn't really a viable source of support for many of Houston's arts groups, particularly smaller and community-based groups. We think that the audience demographics data could be really informative to this conversation, especially in determining to what end any new funds might be used, perhaps building capacity among those smaller groups or funding EDI initiatives across the sector. With that, I'll pause and send it back to Sujin to open it up for questions and conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, Bronwyn, and Beth, for your presentations. This is really fascinating work, and can definitely see how this is going to be helping us as funders and arts organizations figure out how to better serve our communities. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the Q&A. But before I start, I just want to remind everyone that you can type your questions in the rectangular box at the bottom of your screen. And we're also going to switch over the control of the slides to you so that you can feel free to move through them and find a particular slide that you may want to ask a question about. So we have a lot of questions already, and I will start with, I'll start with Elizabeth, since I already have you on. And if you could share a little bit about whether or not you're seeing whether some of the organizations that that you were working with were concerned about sharing their data with DataArts for the demographics pilot, and why, and how you worked with the organizations to with their concerns.
Absolutely. So we did have a few. So about a year ago, we had a kickoff forum where we invited all of Houston Endowments and Houston Arts Alliance's grantees. And the folks from DataArts came and presented about the methodology. And, of course, we invited folks to participate in the pilot conversation or in the pilot project. There was a good bit of conversation about concerns related to sharing patron data. You know, folks were, a few folks expressed concern that, you know, they had not presented to their patrons that they would be sharing their email address or their addresses with another party, with a third party, and that those that information would be aligned with some of the Axiom and some other groups. DataArts really allayed a lot of those concerns, and Beth might be able to speak specifically to some of the methods they were used to protect the data. I will note that there was a small handful of groups who did ultimately decide not to participate in the pilot because of those types of concerns. I can think of a museum and a performing arts groups who did decline to participate. I'll note that we've not, throughout the pilot, had any additional concerns about sharing data. So again, it was a conversation that we had with all the groups around a year ago, but it's not been a concern that's been raised to us since then. And again, Beth might be able to provide a little bit more information about the steps that they take to protect the patron data.
Great, thank you. And I'm gonna pass this to Beth in a second, but before I do that, I'd like to ask Bronwyn kind of the same question. If you had organizations that wanted to opt out or had difficulty, and how you guys dealt with that.
We ran into some individuals, some organizations, and sometimes we get asked, do we really have to do this? Because the challenge for us is that we would send the emails announcing things to an organization, and then it was up to the organization to then turn around and send it to all of their board members, staff, volunteers, and contractors. So one of our challenges was making it clear you need to actually send this out to everyone. So we had a few folks ask us, do we really have to do this? And at all times we made it clear this was not required. There was no money riding on this. You wouldn't lose your grant if you didn't participate. The promise of confidentiality, I think, was absolutely critical. The fact that we could promise them that no one here at the Arts Commission would see their data. And in fact, we are respecting that confidentiality not only at the individual respondent level, but also at the organization level. There are a handful of organizations that had a high enough response rate that they will get an individual organization level report of what their workforce looks like. And we are asking DataArts to send those directly to the organization so that we don't see them at the Arts Commission. That adding that layer of confidentiality we think is very important. We think it's more important that they get the information and that they use it. We also worked very closely with our municipal partners. There are 7 other cities within LA County that do grant making, and so they were important partners in sending information directly to their grantees, many of whom are also our grantees, so that we could make sure that organizations were getting multiple messages from multiple folks so that they would hear it multiple times. And there was just a lot of messaging over the months as well that the survey was open.
Great, thank you. And Beth, would you like to add anything to this?
I would just say that part of what we were able to reassure the organizations about is that we're not asking them to give us their patron data so that we can produce a shared patron database that will be shared with everyone else. And that's the main thing that they have a concern about is both the sharing of that information and the misuse of their relationship with that individual. And so the fact that we commit not to do that is very important, and that for some of you who may have been engaged with some other kinds of endeavors of this type where there is a sense that the lists are going to be shared, we recognize, and we've heard these stories, that organizations will share some of their lists but not all of their lists. Well, at the end of the day, the more information they share, the better off the data will be, and so we just we just really tried to take away as many of those concerns as we possibly could. I also would sort of follow on to what Bronwyn said about the need to create a sense of awareness that this is that this kind of study is going on. Very strongly communicate the why, which when we started into this work and worked with the D5 Coalition and some of the other grant makers, a lot of the questions were around, well, how soon could we make this a condition of a grant? And our advice to the grant makers was there's some road to be traveled here in terms of both building trust, really understanding how to use this information in the most productive way possible, and to create a culture and a climate of learning that is shared with the grantees so that they are as curious about this as the grant makers are. And I will just share briefly, I just came back from the American Alliance of Museums where I co-presented on this same topic with some folks from the Walker Arts Center. In Minneapolis, there's a group of 10 large cultural organizations that came together on their own, not directed by a grant maker, came together to commit to a program of learning and action to diversify their staff. And they are making a commitment to try to achieve 20% diversity by 2020 in their organizations. And it's different disciplines of organizations. They're all organizations with larger than $1 million budget. Or might be larger than 10 million, excuse me. I think I just misspoke. But what I loved about that project, and we had done our pilot initially in Minnesota, but not all of those organizations had participated in the workforce pilot, is that the leadership of that coalition of organizations asked us if we would be willing to administer the workforce study for their group because they were anxious to have a shared baseline, and they wanted to be able to have something to measure progress against over time. So we've committed to do that, and the reason we committed to do it is because I'm so thrilled that this is actually generating from the arts organization themselves, because so often the work we do is something that is, sort of a requirement or something that they feel they must do in order to get a grant. And I really want to support that and be able to model across the country what can happen in a community when a group of organizations decides to take action in this way.
Great, thank you, Beth. I'm going to ask the next question to Bronwyn, and it's particularly these questions are related to being a public agency. So, and I'm going to kind of combine two questions together. One of them is asking about the legal issues that prevent the collection or use of certain data. So, for example, this person remarks that in San Francisco, our sanctuary city ordinance prevents us from collecting data about whether or not a grantee is an immigrant, and in California, Prop 209 prevents the use of racial demographic data in certain decision making. So I wanted to ask a little bit about kind of the constraints of being a public funder. And then the other question also related to being a public agency is how do you respect confidentiality, and if there's any kind of concern about sunshine requests, about public disclosure requests.
Okay, they're great questions. Yeah, we're very aware of Prop 209, and we talk about, we have had conversations amongst amongst staff about what we can and can't ask, what we can and can't report. There is this survey. We are not using any of the findings from our workforce survey for any kind of grant-making decisions. So at this time, we believe that we are, Prop 209 doesn't apply. We are conducting a research study. It is useful information that we can use in planning, decision making. We can share it with the field. We can share it with our authorizers, the County Board of Supervisors. The fact that this survey is part of a much larger cultural equity and inclusion initiative, it also helps us in that regard. The county had directed us to conduct a very public process, to hold town halls across the county to discuss issues around cultural equity and inclusion, not just for staff and boards, but also audiences, participants, artists as well. So this being part of that larger discussion makes it easier to have those conversations, I think. As to the question about sunshine requirements, we don't hold any of the data. That data is held by DataArts, and all the aggregate findings we are sharing in our report. I believe that we would meet any kind of sunshine requirements in terms of that final report. It's publicly available, and I hope folks will read it, and I hope folks in our other stakeholders here in LA County are reading it and thinking about what this means for them in terms of who they're serving and who their workforce is.
Thank you, Bronwyn. I'm going to ask the next couple of questions. I'm going to combine some questions for Elizabeth as well. And a couple of folks ask about how the Houston Endowment is using the data to make the case for grant making to certain groups, like those that are led by people of color or women. So what are some of the strategies or approaches that you're taking given what you learned or are learning? And just a follow-up to that is, will there be a published report on your project?
Sure. So I'll start by noting that we have just recently got, the pilot the first phase of the pilot has very recently concluded. So we have only within the past, I would say, month, obtained the aggregate information as well as the information for each of the participating pilot groups. So quite frankly, we're still reviewing it and learning from it and determining what our next steps will be. I don't know that we imagine using particularly the reports for individual groups to make specific grant-making decisions. And I'll note that at this time we've not done the workforce pilot yet. That's a stage that's to come. So we will be implementing the workforce survey within the coming months, but we haven't done that yet, so we're not sure what sort of changes we'll make as a result. Again, I know that we are looking at, or we are hoping to work with individual groups on addressing EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion within their practices and within their organizational organizations. And we're also hoping to work across the sector. For example, Houston Endowment funds a couple of sector-wide capacity building initiatives. For example, a 3-year project called Engage that works with a cohort of 30 to 40 organizations each 3-year round. And we're hoping with these findings to infuse or elevate more than has been in the past EDI principles going forward. With that, we hope to touch a larger number of groups than we might through our direct grant making. Of course, we do plan to have conversations with individual grantees about their results and about strategies that may be beneficial or might help drive them toward increasing diversity within their audiences. I mentioned the example with Stages. They were certainly an early adopter, and they were one of the earliest pilot participants as well. So we've had a little bit more time to reflect on the results with them. That's why we're a little further along. So. Oh, and regarding whether there will be a published report for the Houston demographics pilot, I imagine there will be. Again, we're just at the point of getting the raw data back, so we have not moved to the point of a report yet, but we are hoping to be able to share findings broadly, and of course are hopeful that other states or metro areas would like to participate in this pilot as well, so that, again, ultimately it could become a module within the CDP.
Thank you. We look forward to seeing that report when it's ready. Beth, I'm going to hand the next couple of questions to you, and again, I'm going to do a little bit of combining because we have a lot of questions that are kind of similar. One's about the use of ethnicity versus race. One person asks that mentions that the UN stopped using race as an identifier in 50s in favor of using ethnicity. And do you find any limitations using race versus ethnicity? And also another question about, would you recommend use, so you guys use the definition of heritage in place of what you're currently using for what we're currently using for ethnicity. I mean, I guess from the GIA standpoint, we definitely are interested in racial equity. So for us, I think understanding race categories and how inequity is happening through races is something that from the GI standpoint, I think it'd be really important for us to understand. And then we have another question, again, about ethnicity, so on your heritage survey, you had Black and people of African descent and white and people of European descent. And one person was asking about why not Asian as well. So I'm sorry, that's a lot wrapped up in ethnicity, but hopefully we can tackle some of those.
So the way this survey was developed was through a very consultative process with a large number of stakeholders in the field. So there were, as I said, folks from the D5 Coalition, from GuideStar, from the Foundation Center, also from very specific both ethnic, heritage, cultural, and and other identity-based organizations involved. And so there was quite a lot of dialogue about the selection of these categories and how we came to choose what is here. So I will say that this reflects a fairly significant process of negotiation, if you will, around some of these topics. And for example, I will share that when we did the first pilot, we did not ask the LGBTQ questions. And the reason we did not ask them is that in consultation with the group, there were very serious concerns that were being raised at that time about the category not being protected class, and a lot of concerns about legal implications of that. And so we did not include those questions at the beginning of the pilot. When we put the surveys out into the field for piloting, we also asked for a lot of feedback from our respondents. And we got a lot of feedback from our respondents. And the change to actually add the LGBTQ questions, we really made that decision partly because of some of the changes that were happening in 2015 when we were developing this, and partly 2015 and 2016, and partly because the organizations strongly asked for it. So in the regard to ethnicity and heritage, we really took the advice of the stakeholder groups who were part of the process, as opposed to our making a firm decision on our own. In addition, the inclusion of race allows us to, the inclusion of race does allow us to do some of that back mapping that I talked about to the U.S. Census for purposes of comparison. And as many of you know, the census is also reconsidering those categories, and so we will be closely following those developments. And as the field moves forward in terms of how best to define and what language to use, we will certainly be following that and adapting to it.
Great, thank you. Elizabeth, I believe that you wanted to weigh in on this.
Yeah, I thought I'd just make a note. One thing that we particularly valued through the audience demographics pilot is that we were not just looking at race and ethnicity. Houston, as many of y'all may know, is a majority-minority community, and we have some, I would say, fairly long-standing groups of different racial and ethnic profiles that have a good bit of power and that have a good, higher income communities. We recognize that, or we hope that our grant-making benefits under-resourced communities or groups. And therefore, we were really, it was very important to us that we look beyond race and ethnicity and look, for example, at income and education and other socioeconomic indicators. So I thought I'd just throw that in there as well.
Thank you for that, adding that element to the story. Beth, I think I'm going to pass another question on to you, and it's really about cost. One person asked, how much of what's being discussed is available to smaller organizations who do not have the significant budget available for this type of data collection and analysis? And I'm guessing that you probably would have the most information on cost and capacity.
Right. So at this juncture, the studies are being administered. They have all been either grant or service organization funded studies. We have not had any where we've had a request from an individual arts organization to administer a workforce or a audience study to them. And part of the process, and the reason we're doing this, these pilots and doing this work, for example, in the audience demographics in Houston, is to understand whether or not it can be done at a scale of or a level of cost that could be affordable and equitable. So I can't answer the question to say that I know the answer to that yet, because that's part of what we're learning through the next year or so. But to be clear, this is not a situation where we are simply administering a single survey to 200 organizations where one individual in 200 organizations is going to answer a series of questions. You know, when we did the LA County survey, it's really processing and dealing with 3,300 surveys from 3,300 individuals. So there is, and when you turn that, when you go to the audience side where we're dealing with information on millions of individuals, there is certainly, you know, an exponential factor that goes into play in terms of the getting the data and analyzing the data and then reporting on the data. So, for example, you can imagine producing, if 200 organizations participate, we then would turn around and produce, if they all achieve sufficient statistical validity, 200 individual reports. So that starts to not feel so scalable unless it can be highly automated and made, you know, relatively easy to do without a huge amount of individual administration. So that's part of what we're learning through this process. So it's an extremely good question you're asking, and I hope we will be closer to an answer by the end of this process.
Great. Thank you. And Bronwyn, you had mentioned that the data that you guys found was not all that different than what you suspected. So again, with the cost question, was it worth it?
Absolutely, yes. For a couple of reasons. First up, I mean, we had our suspicions, and we were starting to see reports from, you know, museums and some other geographies, but we needed to know what did LA look like in order to have an informed, fact-based conversation. And the ability to dig deeper from just those high-level, you know, race of the workforce overall, age of the workforce overall, to dig deeper into types of organizations and budget sizes, and then the ability for individual organizations to get a picture of themselves. I think that's really valuable. And as we go into our second year of running this survey, we're going to really focus our communications around, hey, organizations, if you get your response rate high enough, we can deliver an individual organization level report to you. So it's incredibly valuable in all of those ways, and definitely worth the cost.
So we're at the top of the hour, but I want to, before we go, I just want to take a moment again to thank Beth, Bronwyn, and Elizabeth for joining us and sharing this exciting work. It feels like, you know, we're just seeing something, you know, being birthed, and there's a lot of lessons that we're already learning, and can see how this is going to grow and how it'll help our members and funders in the future. So thank you so much. Thank you for DataArts for taking the lead on this and working with our other organizations. Just so before we go, today's presentation has been recorded. We will be sending you a link to that file along with the brief survey, and we'll also be sharing a link to the slide deck, so you will have an opportunity to look through that in the future. But also feel free to stay in the room for another hour or so, and you can flip through the slides at that point. So your feedback is always important to us. Please take a moment to fill out the survey when you receive that email. And thank you again for joining us. Have a great afternoon.